Hi, everyone. Welcome to our online discussion as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of World Earth Day. I'm J.D. Talasic. I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this platform. Today's discussion is organized by two offices of the National Academy of Sciences, LabX and my office, Cultural Programs. It is part of a series of events that we call the Eternal Experience. The focal point for the series is a sculpture that currently hangs at the NAS building, Eternal, a 60-foot long jellyfish constructed out of thousands of plastic bags. It was created by scientist and artist Maris Polenko. Like many institutions, the building is currently closed, but we do hope to be able to welcome you back to the historic home of the National Academy of Sciences very soon. The sculpture Eternal, it points towards a range of many ideals that include ocean conservation and climate change. For Earth Day, it was our hope to present the work of the ClimateMusic Project and to welcome the Telegraph Quartet to our auditorium at the NAS. But instead, given the current situation, we will have an online discussion. And in the next hour and a half, we will hear from thought leaders who are behind the climate music and explore the potential relationship between music and science. To lead this discussion, I can think of no one better suited person than Barbara Stauffer. Barbara is Chief of Community Programs at the National Museum of Natural History here in DC, and she has long been at the center of conversations on art, science, and public engagement. So it is my pleasure to turn this platform over to Barbara. Barbara, welcome, and welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, JD. And I'd also like to welcome you, the audience, and say Happy Earth Day. And I'm very excited for today's program because we'll be learning more about the ClimateMusic Project and discussing one piece in particular, the piece that was going to be performed, Icarus in Flight. And we have with us an esteemed group of people who can then tell us more about the thinking behind the piece, the music behind the piece, the science behind the piece. So one thing I wanted to just let you know what to expect in the program. Rather than listening to an entire recording of the composition, we thought this was a great opportunity to highlight some selections of the composition, and these have been specially selected by the team. So we will play 4 clips with kind of discussion in between the clips. And I also want to let you know that we'll be taking questions throughout the program. Most of us have spent a lot of time on Zoom, but in case you're not familiar with it, down at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button, and you can type your questions in there and they will be sent our way. And I will weave them into and include them in the conversation whenever possible. So to get things started, I'd like to just show you a little film about the ClimateMusic Project. Thank you.
Scientific data. I know how to read a graph, but it doesn't necessarily speak to me with a kind of urgency, emotional or visceral component. That is something we so often associate with musical experiences.
Music Project as one of many projects that's now setting out to communicate climate science in a very broad spectrum, hearts, minds, values. And I think that's an immensely important development.
Okay, and as the credits are rolling, I next would like to introduce the discussants for today, a few of whom you've seen in the sizzle reel. I'd like to start with Richard Festinger. Could you just raise your hand, Richard? There we go. So Richard's the composer of Icarus in Flight, the piece that we'll be discussing in detail today. Richard has garnered international recognition for his extensive catalog of vocal and instrumental compositions. His music has been described as notable for its combination of propulsive energy with an impeccable sense of poise and balance. And WQXR Radio in New York has dubbed him an American master. Festinger is a professor of composition at San Francisco State University, where he's also artistic director of the Morrison Artist Series. He received MA and PhD degrees in composition from the University of California, Berkeley. And in the mid-'80s, he co-founded the acclaimed San Francisco-based modern music ensemble Earplay. Festinger's work have been recorded for the Naxos, Bridge, CRI, Centaur, and CRS labels. And he is the recipient of numerous major awards and commissions, including the Walter Hinrichsen Award and an Academy Recording Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So welcome, Richard. Next, I'd like to introduce Bill Collins, who's the lead science advisor for the Icarus in Flight composition. Bill is an internationally recognized expert in climate modeling and climate change science. His personal research concerns the interactions among greenhouse gases and aerosols, the coupled climate system, and global environmental change. At Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Bill serves as the director for the Climate and Ecological Sciences Division. At the University of California, Berkeley, he teaches in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science and directs the new multi-campus Climate Readiness Institute. He was a lead author on the 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for which the IPCC, as it's known, was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, and was also a lead author on the recent 5th assessment by the IPCC. He received his undergraduate degree in physics from Princeton University and earned an MS and PhD in astrophysics from the University of Chicago. So welcome, Bill. And next, I'd like to introduce Lori Goldman. She's Director of Public Engagement for the ClimateMusic Project. She's a veteran public policy professional who has held positions in government, industry, and academia. Lori most recently served as Deputy Director of UC Berkeley's Global Engagement Office, overseeing the development of partnerships with international universities and advising the campus on best practices for global engagement in a higher education context. As head of global trade policy for Levi Strauss & Company, Lori advised on global trade and development issues. She's always been passionate about working with institutions committed to a greater good and has sought out opportunities to engage on global concerns. Lori holds a master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University and an undergraduate degree in political science from Tufts University. Welcome, Lori. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Amanda Stout with the National Academies of Sciences here in Washington, DC. In her role as director of the Board on Atmospheric Sciences and Climate and the Polar Research Board at the National Research Council, Amanda provides institutional oversight for both boards. In previous positions at the National Wildlife Federation and the BASC, she directed a number of high-profile studies, communicated climate science and impacts to key decision makers and the general public, developed the intellectual and practical foundation for climate-informed conservation, and advanced climate change science education. Amanda served on a 2013 National Climate Assessment Steering Committee and was an editor of Climate Smart Conservation, a 2014 guide produced by an expert work group that included representatives from government, nonprofits, and academia. She received her BA cum laude in environmental science and engineering from Harvard University and her PhD in atmospheric sciences from Harvard University. Welcome, Amanda. So we have quite the panel here, a lot of heft. And I guess I wanted to just start things off, invite Bill to just give a little background on the project.
Thank you so much, Barbara. We are really honored to be part of the 50th Earth Day celebrations here at the National Academy, and it's really wonderful to join you and your colleagues in sharing the work that we've been doing as part of the ClimateMusic Project. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the project itself and then a little bit about the piece, but leave the real description of the piece to Richard, who will follow me to describe how he translated data into a piece of music, which is a real process in and of itself. So the ClimateMusic Project is a nonprofit collaboration among musicians, scientists like myself, technology experts, and a number of them contributed to today's performance, and public policy professionals. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and actively engage diverse audiences on climate change. And in essence, we seek to make climate change personal in a way that the IPCC and other normal ways of communicating science really can't. We do this through the creation and performance of science-guided music. Of course, what we're going to hear today is the work by Richard Festinger, 4 clips from it. The work Icarus in Flight was composed by Richard, working in collaboration with me and other science partners from the University of California, Berkeley, and Berkeley Lab. And the piece uses historical data and models related to kind of the drivers of climate change, and those are population growth, emissions of carbon dioxide, the way that we've altered the landscape. And the piece lasts from the late 19th century, from 1880, projected out to 2080. So it lasts 200 years from end to end. And we'll hear 4 segments of it that Richard will describe in just a moment. I wanted just to make sure that you understand that the piece actually relays a couple of different futures for us. So we're going to hear 2 clips related to the historical past. And those are based on observations of population and carbon dioxide emissions and land use that are based on historically grounded data. But once we get into the clips that relate to the future, you'll hear 2 different scenarios that we prepared for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these lay out 2 different pathways. One of them is essentially business as usual. And the code name that goes under in the IPCC world is RCP 8.5, which is a term that only its mother could love, but it stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. And the 8.5 refers to the imbalance in the Earth's energy budget, 8.5 watts per meter squared by the end of the 21st century. And that's going to make the planet approximately 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is in pre-industrial times by the year 2100. The second scenario that we analyzed and presented to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is one known as RCP 2.6. So it's a representative concentration pathway where we hold the imbalance in the Earth's energy budget to just 2.6 watts per meter squared. And that involves very active measures to mitigate climate change, and it manages to hold us under 2 degrees Celsius. And as Richard will describe to you, you'll hear those 2 different scenarios compared and contrasted once we get into the future. I want to let you know that all the information that we used in this piece is in the public domain. It's all been heavily vetted by scientists such as myself, and in fact by the international community. And all the IPCC findings have ultimately been accepted by the UN General Assembly. So the data that underpins this piece has been about as thoroughly peer-reviewed as one could possibly attain. That said, we want to convey it in a way that's accessible. And so our goal is to convey a sense of urgency of the issue and a drive to action by presenting this information to you in the form of a compelling piece of music. And we would like you to come away from the performance feeling hopeful and feeling incentivized. We have the tools to make meaningful difference, but we have to embrace the individual and collective will to act. And with that, let me turn the floor over to Richard, who'll describe to you exactly how he took this data that we handed him and turned it into a great piece of music.
Thank you very much, Bill. As Bill mentioned, the piece is involved with a historical period beginning in 1880 and projected out to 2080, so a period of 200 years of historical time. And each year of historical time is represented by about 8 seconds of musical time. The piece is divided into 3 large sections, 1880 to 1945, a period where growth of population, carbon emissions, and transformation of land use is growing slowly without major concerns. There's about 1.4 billion people in the world. Carbon emissions are 236 million tons a year, and the portion of the land's non-ice surface land that's adapted to human use is around 13%. The second part of the piece models the years 1945 roughly to the present. And this is a period of, as I'm sure you know, of exponential growth in all these areas. Population of the world is now 7.5 billion. Carbon emissions are, I don't know, Bill could speak to that probably better than I, but I think around 10,000 million tons per year, something like that. And transformation of land use, I think we're now somewhere probably around 35% of the non-ice land of the earth is adapted to human use, which means habitation, agriculture, grazing lands, etc. The third large part of the piece is the future. It begins 2015, I guess, so a little bit before the real present, and is projected out to 2080. And as Bill was saying, that part of the piece, as we'll hear, I'll talk a bit more about this later, as there's an alternation between the two representative concentration pathways that Bill just described. So the music alternates between a kind of a best case rosy scenario and a worst case nightmare scenario. And let me just briefly describe how the data are translated into musical materials. Population growth is represented by the number of units, the number of musical events in a unit of time. So as the piece progresses and population grows, there are more and more musical events. The music becomes denser and more active. The carbon emissions, this was the difficult one because because the range is so enormous between what we experienced in 1880 and what the projections are in the worst case for 2080. The closest I could get in musical dimensions to this was the difference between the lowest frequency that the ensemble I'm working with, which is the string quartet, could produce, and the highest frequency. So I had to scale this a little bit, but growth in carbon emissions is represented by a greater distance between the lowest and highest sounding pitches. And finally, transformation of land use is represented in the music by specialized playing timbres or tone colors. So, and I'll point out some of those to you before we hear the clips so that you'll be able to identify them easily. So that's the piece in a nutshell. And Barbara, I'm not sure how you want to proceed. You want to go right on to the next clip, or to the first clip, or?
I think it'd be great. And before that, are there a few things you want our audience to listen for maybe in that first clip?
Yes, there are. But before I do that, let me just introduce, let me say a few words about the Telegraph String Quartet, who gave the premiere performance and would have performed it today at the National Academy of Sciences. The Telegraph Quartet is one of the great young string quartets performing today. They are Eric Chin and Joseph Miley on violin, Pei Ling Lin on viola, and Jeremiah Shaw on cello. Their many accolades include the United States' two most prestigious chamber music honors. In 2016, they won the Walter Naumburg Chamber Music Award, and in 2014, they won the grand prize at the Fischoff Chamber Music Competition. The quartet has performed in concert halls and music festivals across the United States and abroad, including performances in New York's Carnegie Hall, San Francisco's Hertz Theater, and the Emilia-Romagna Festival in Italy. They are currently quartet in residence on the chamber music faculty of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and we're very happy to have them in the San Francisco Bay Area. There is a graphic that plays along with the music. And let me describe that to you. Its intent is to provide you with the information so that you can tell where you are in the music. The graphic, which was designed by Wei Dong Yang of Kinetech Arts, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit that combines the work of dancers, scientists, and digital artists to create innovative and socially responsible performances. And the graphic is in the form of a large clock face. The hand of the clock rotates once during the course of the piece, which piece lasts about somewhere between 28 and 30 minutes, depending on the performer's tempos. The clock hand shows you what year it is. There's on the left-hand panel, well, you'll see in the middle of the clock face is a map of the Earth, and it's populated by little green trees and little red human beings. And over the course of the piece, you'll see the trees transform themselves into human beings as humans begin to utilize more and more of the Earth's surface. And the actual percentages are shown in the left-hand panel. Below that, you'll also see the number for carbon emissions measured in gigatons of carbon. And below that, the population of the Earth for the year where we are in the piece. There's also a right-hand panel, but you see that won't be active until the third part of the piece, when it will change from, I think, blue to red, depending on whether the piece is currently occupied with RCP, concentration pathway 2.6 or concentration pathway 8.5. And so let me just talk about the first clip of the piece. It lasts about 3 minutes. It sets the character of the piece and gives a kind of a baseline for contrast with the more dramatic music that comes later in the piece. The music at the beginning is slow moving, reflecting the slow gradual growth of population, carbon emissions, and land use at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. This part it's divided into 13 sections of 40 seconds each representing 5 years of musical time, and we'll just hear a couple of those. But I think you'll hear that those are easy to distinguish the boundaries, and also easily audible are the specialized timbres that represent the percentage of the Earth that's devoted to human use. And those specialized timbres at the beginning of the piece include tremolo bowing, which is a very rapid bowing, and a type of playing called sul ponticello, where the player plays very close to the bridge of the instrument, producing a very fragile, brittle, metallic sort of sound. So those are the things to listen to in the first part, in the first clip, and I think we're ready to roll that, Barbara.
Should we? Okay, great. Let's watch that clip. All right, thank you. So I have to say that, so the first time I heard this clip, it definitely struck me very slow, very stately. And I guess before we kind of get into the music and the science of it, I wanted to actually ask Amanda, when we talked about it, you had a kind of slightly different take on it. I think you might want to share that.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, the music is tranquil in a way, but at the same time, it feels very foreboding to me. It really evokes for me part of what I view as a major challenge in doing climate communication. And that is, as we look around where I am today, it's a beautiful day out, beautiful blue sky, the trees are leafing out, and nature is in full effect. It's hard to think about that there's this risk lurking out there from these kind of everyday activities that we do, whether it be driving our car or heating our homes. And so, as we try to talk to people and motivate action, there's this kind of contradiction between what we see in front of us and our daily experience of our activities with the effect that they may have long down the road. And I think that's something that's very present to me as I think about talking about climate change. And I feel like that comes through really effectively in the piece and kind of captures that very well.
And Bill and Richard, you're probably happy to hear that.
Yeah, very much so. Well, Amanda was right to put her finger on foreboding a little bit, because the scientist who anticipated global warming actually did his work during the period of time covered by this piece of music. There's a scientist named Arrhenius working in Europe, and he was the first person to put together the fact that the industrial age had started. We knew we were burning coal and releasing carbon dioxide to the Earth's atmosphere. And scientists in the 19th century had now made measurements of the fact that carbon dioxide can absorb heat. There were John Tyndall in the UK and a number of other scientists had figured that out. And so he put these two facts together, the absorption of heat by carbon dioxide and the fact that it's increasing in concentration, and was the first to predict that if we kept things up, we would warm the planet. And so it's remarkable, that we're, roughly 125 years later. But you're right, the piece is foreboding for precisely the reason that he made the prediction during this period of time in the late 19th century.
And because I know you started at 1880, because was that when he first wrote about that?
No, this is it's a common reference period for us in the IPCC world to start in the late 19th century. So.
Great. Well, thank you. I know you've already told us about the Telegraph Quartet. I guess because did you pick them for any particular reason related to this composition, or what was it that made them particularly suited to this
Well,
piece?
it's because they're such skilled performers. I knew I could write anything for them, and they would be able to execute it with aplomb. And I really felt that would be necessary. From a composer standpoint, that's always necessary and desirable. Yeah. But I knew this piece would get very complicated and very demanding on the performers. And I wanted to have the best quartet I could find available to do it. And that's why we chose them.
And because it's some of it's really the challenge of, in some ways you composed with data, right? I don't know if you've ever done that before, but if you want to talk a little bit about what that process is like.
Well, that was a very different way of working for me. It was very challenging. The challenges were ones I had not worked with before, for one thing, and composers work all very differently. For me, this piece had to be planned in considerable detail in advance. Had to be divided up into sections. I had to make decisions about how many events would occur in a given amount of time, what the range of pitches would be from low to high in a particular amount of time, and how many pitches would be colored by these kinds of unusual timbres. But I also reserved the domains of melodic and harmonic invention to myself, right? Those were determined by me. And that's what I think that goes a long ways towards the difference between creating a piece of music using data and sonification of data, where data might just be translated in a straightforward, naive fashion into some kind of sonic terms.
Right, because it's not just recording data; it's creating a musical, an emotional piece around it too. So, yeah.
Barbara, I've described this as being a little bit like a Houdini act. I mean, we hand the composer a straitjacket, and the straitjacket is, the data is very unforgiving once you get into the 21st century, and things are going off the rails. And been astonished twice at watching, composers, really skilled composers, wiggle their way out of the straitjacket. But it's a tough thing to do.
The creative process, yeah.
It's true, it is tough. But one of the difficult things is that when you look at the curves of this data, they all look very much the same, which is like this, right? Exponential growth. And when you think about music doesn't generally behave that way. Music kind of goes in waves, maybe successively higher waves, reaching a climax. But this kind of one monodirectional sort of thing is not something we find very often as what we think of as a compelling musical shape.
And because it kind of goes off the rails, you had to also figure out what's that starting point, right? That you can actually build on. Right?
Yes, and one of the things that you heard in the first clip is that everything occurs in a very narrow frequency range. If this were a piano piece, it would all be in a very small range in the middle of the piano keyboard.
Yeah, and that allows you to expand. And I know, Amanda, you were going to say something, and then Lori. Right?
Sure. Well, it's striking to me that this project both forced Richard to get outside of his comfort zone in the way that he does composing, but I think it also likely pushes Bill and other climate scientists out of their comfort zone. I mean, I know in my training, we are taught to be objective, to trim away the subjective and the feeling. Part of the reason I went into environmental science is because I didn't want to have to deal directly with human suffering and the emotion of that. I wanted to do something good for the world, but not be that close to it. And of course, I learned as I got into this that to do effective climate communication or communication about any environmental issue, you need to connect with people on an emotional level. And that people make decisions and change their behavior, not because of facts, but because of their values and how they feel about things. And I think that's sort of the genius of this project in finding a way where there can be dialogue between those. And hopefully I've given Lori a good jumping off point here to talk more about the ClimateMusic Project.
That's exactly along the lines of what I was going to say. Is the reason that we've chosen not to do sonification is because it doesn't reach people emotionally. I mean, it's really interesting from an intellectual perspective to see a sonified data, but it doesn't reach your hearts and minds like the way a musician, a composer like Richard can come and draw out kind of the emotion in the data by combining the two. And that's, yeah, so that's why the ClimateMusic Project exists.
Great, thank you. Should we listen to the next clip, do you think? Okay, and Richard, do you want to tell us a little bit what to be listening for?
Yes, so the second clip represents the years 1962 to 1987. So about 15 years after the end of the Second World War, and it's really at the end of the Second World War that all these data really take off. And so we're in now this period of exponential growth. And what you'll hear that this music is very strongly contrasting to the music that we heard in the first clip. It's much, much more active. The frequency range is much wider, and it develops much more quickly. And also you'll hear a couple of other types of specialized timbres that again, represent the human, increasing human use of the earth. In this section, I introduced also trills and pizzicato, which is a technique where the players pluck the strings rather than bowing them. So again, this clip lasts about 3 minutes, I think.
Do you want to say something about what to listen for around 1979?
Around 1979, I'm not sure.
And you said there was some international, there's some little.
Okay, well, there is one more. There is one more element that I included in the piece. It's a little hard to describe, but yeah, I compiled a list of international meetings to deal with climate change, and at the moments when those meetings occurred, there are these very brief moments of repose, like little mini cadences in the music, and it's difficult to describe because they don't stand out. They're very brief, because these meetings, of course, were very brief, and so. But there is one that's somewhat prominent. If you listen carefully, you'll hear this moment of repose on an interval of major third. So that's
yeah. No, I thought I have to admit I have a little trouble hearing them, but I just love knowing that they're there.
Yeah, they're there.
Okay.
I would have to point them out to you.
All right. Well, thank you. And let's listen to clip number 2. So you can definitely hear the tempo increasing. And actually, I wanted to share a comment that came in from the audience. Jim said it sounds like music from a Hitchcock movie. So you've definitely kind of captured that building, that growing suspense, I guess, although we kind of know what happens. And then actually, I wanted to just share a question that came in from the audience as well, which is to Richard. You talked a little bit about this, but what was the greatest challenge you faced in composing this piece?
I think the greatest challenge was, as I mentioned earlier, I had to begin by structuring the entire piece. So I mentioned that it's divided into 3 large sections. Each of those sections is divided into smaller subsections. There are altogether about 47 of these subsections in the piece, lasting anywhere from 42 seconds maybe to 18 seconds, something like that. And it was a great challenge filling in these expanses of time in a way that made a compelling musical phrase structure. Like that was the most difficult thing, and making sure there were the right number of events representing population growth, and that that was challenging. Like I had to keep a tally marks of how many events there.
There's an incredible number of constraints, right, in terms of the timing and the number of events and things you had to include.
Yeah.
And then, so, again, we talked a little bit about the international meetings that are represented in those little pauses. I have to admit, I found myself every time I kind of hold my breath a little bit when they're coming up. But what would do you want to talk a little bit about what was going on in science and research at the time?
This was, Barbara, this is a really active time. Just before the clip starts, so in the late 1950s, Roger Verval, who was at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, figured out that oceans could not act as a big sponge for carbon dioxide. That had been kind of a prevailing theory. And so he knocked that theory, pardon the pun, out of the water. And then in the 1960s, a number of scientists began exploring the implications of the fact that CO2 is going to remain in the Earth's atmosphere and enhance the greenhouse effect. Suki Manabe, who was at Princeton at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, started doing some path-breaking experiments showing how the planet would warm, and you would also alter the hydrological cycle as the planet got hotter. There were a number of other really important scientific discoveries. So in addition to carbon dioxide, a scientist named Ramanathan, who was at the time at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, showed that chlorofluorocarbons could act as a greenhouse gas. And this was a really, really important finding and motivated the controls on them, because they would have contributed to a huge amount of warming if they had been left uncontrolled. He and a postdoc also showed that methane and nitrous oxide are greenhouse gases. And so we started creating this sort of rogues gallery of greenhouse gases during this time. And at the very end of the piece, this clip, just after 1987, was when Jim Hansen was invited by Al Gore to testify in front of Congress. And so Dr. Hansen got around the restrictions put on him by the Republican administrations at the time, and actually was able to give his unvarnished view of what global warming would do to the Earth's climate. And so, the piece is sort of dovetailed by discovery that the ocean isn't going to save us, and then at the other end of the piece by Jim Hansen revealing to Congress just what the consequences would be for business as usual. So it's a very important time scientifically.
I think you're on mute, Barbara.
So a couple of people asked similar questions, basically, again, for Richard, whether in the music you depicted catastrophes like the H-bomb, Chernobyl, things like that in the music.
No.
No, okay. So again, you're working with that very specific climate data, right? So that's the
I
one.
was working with the shape of the data, with the trends of the data, not with the only specific events that are represented are these international meetings. And again, those are fleeting events in the music, you know, with all deference to Bill and all the wonderful scientists he works with. These international meetings have much less prominence than we wish they did. So they end up being somewhat sort of fleeting events in the piece.
So it's kind of poignant that they're there, that they're marks, but also fleeting.
Barbara, I should say that the event that you were referring to earlier and that Richard was just alluding to is the so-called Charney Report led by Jules Charney. He was another scientist at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. And this report has actually had lasting impact. We still reference it today. It still sort of looms behind the IPCC process because they made an incredibly prescient prediction about what doubling carbon dioxide would do to the Earth's climate. And the range they gave was it would warm the climate by somewhere between 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius, which just, you know, roughly double by 2 to get Fahrenheit. So that's somewhere between roughly 3 to roughly 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And that prediction made with computers that were literally 1 billion times slower than what we have now has completely stood the test of time. It's remarkable how great a job they did. And that's the event in 1979.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Actually, so that,
Yeah,
may I?
Yeah, of course.
So that report was a publication of the National Academy of Sciences. It was authored by Jules Charney and a committee of other experts that we convened. And so I actually have the privilege and honor of shepherding and stewarding that work since then. And so I have a copy of that report on my shelf, which I keep hidden away behind a locked cabinet because it is really treasured. And it's, you know, one of the things that's remarkable about it is it's very, very short. I think 40 pages or something like that. And compared to some of the reports that Bill has worked on and referred to in the IPCC, which are hundreds, thousands of pages long of analysis. And yet it's been so incredibly impactful. We actually just brought together some of the authors of that report, including Jim Hansen and Suki Manabe, who were not authors, but they contributed their data to it for an event in a few months ago. Which was an amazing to just be sort of in the audience, watching them reflect upon that experience from 40 years ago and where we are today. And really the thing they kept coming back to is the need to be taking action and how imperative it is that we be, you know, acting on the knowledge that we've had now for so many decades.
And that's kind of an interesting, I mean, so scientists have been studying the effects of writing about, making predictions about climate change for well over 100 years now. And I guess like how it seems like kind of public understanding has lagged. So in some ways, do you want to talk a little bit about what was going on with public understanding during this time period? And maybe, you know, as we go through the pieces, we talk a little bit about how it evolves.
Well, Barbara, if you go back and look at Earth Day, so 50 years ago,
yeah,
Earth Day was really focused on air and water quality. I mean, those were, Los Angeles had terrible smog. I remember visiting it as a child and being shocked. It reminded me, I mean, now when I think about it, Los Angeles in 1970 was Beijing now. So there was a huge focus on air and water quality because those were things that you could see and taste. And what we've come to appreciate since then is that the things that we can't see, we can't smell, and we can't taste, namely the greenhouse gases, those have become kind of the big public enemy number one. And so the evolution has evolved. I am happy to say that the awareness in the United States, according to polling done by Yale and other reputable public policy research institutes, indicates that the public now is very aware of the reality of global warming. And in certain areas of the country, the acceptance approaches that in Europe. So we It's taken a while, but we're getting there. So I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you. And actually, a question from the audience. I guess what's the, and then we can go on to the next clip, but you know, what's the age group that did you target a specific age group with this piece in particular? And does the climate change or climate music project kind of target a particular age group?
Well, I can take on that. So obviously different types of music appeal to different communities. This, I think Richard would probably agree, chamber music tends to be, you know, not children, it tends to be, you know, in the adult range. Our aim, however, for the Climate Music Project is to bring different types of music to different audiences. We have, this is one of 3 current compositions we have in our portfolio. One is jazz and spoken word, one is more electronic. We're aiming to do some compositions that would be geared towards younger audiences. So our goal is to reach a broad array of communities at all ages, all types of diversity. You know, reggae, why not, right? So yeah, but this piece is tends to attract a more adult audience.
Yeah, thank you. Do we want to listen
Laura,
to the
you
third piece,
might,
or did you have a, yeah?
Laura,
Richard,
you might want to say a word about, I mean, there have been some ideas about developing the means for just anyone to get a hold of and compose their own music.
Yeah, I was going to save that for kind of the follow on, but yes, we do aim to create an online process where we can engage with a network of musicians around the globe who can create their own climate music based on parameters that we set. We're already testing that with a collaboration we have with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, where their students work with data sets that we provide and create all sorts of amazing pieces of music. The range is really fascinating. And so our goal is to really create a network of musicians throughout the world that will reach their own, they already have audiences, and we'd like to be able to work in some climate activism and reach the audiences that they already are reaching.
Thank you. Thinking should we listen to the third? And now, Richard, this is the one where you start having 2 scenarios, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So maybe just let us know what to listen for.
Yes. So again, this clip lasts about 3 minutes, and this is the beginning. Let's see, it represents the years 2016 to 2034, and this is the beginning of the final large part of the piece. So this is the part of the piece where the music alternates between these 2 representative concentration pathways. And I think you'll find that that's rather easy to hear, and also the clock face in the graphics gives you tips you off, because you'll see the right-hand panel will turn red when we're in a section of the piece that's representing RCP 8.5. Trying to think what else I should say. Well, I think the main thing is that there's a return to some of the musical materials of the very beginning of the piece, but they're more energized, they're moving faster, and they're accompanied by a kind of a repeated note ostinato, this repeated note idea that keeps repeating, and that kind of gives more energy to the ideas that were more tranquil at the beginning of the piece. And you'll hear I think you'll hear easily the contrast between RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. So I think that's enough introduction.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, let's listen to the third clip. Okay, so things are heating up. You hear it in the music. So I guess actually, Bill, I know you talked about the, and I know this was a new concept to me, but the RCP values, and that kind of were selected for the two scenarios. Could you just talk a little bit more about those, and maybe are there lots of values in between, or just
Sure.
explain that?
No, it's a great question, Barbara. What the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does is they assess a set of predictions, but without really a value judgment attached to them. So we essentially say, if you make this choice, here are the consequences. And the choices typically range from something that could roughly be thought of as business as usual, and then added on top of that, greater and greater measures to mitigate climate change. But all that information is presented in the report without really any value judgment. We essentially say, if you go down this path, here's what you get. In this particular assessment, which is, this information is drawn from the 5th or last IPCC assessment that was issued in 2013. We evaluated 4 different scenarios. There were 2 others that were between RCP 2.6 and 8.5. So these really represent, if you will, the end members, the one that's most like business as usual, and the one with the greatest mitigation measures.
Okay, yeah.
One other important thing to point out about the particular period of time that this clip covers is that this period of time is really critical for policy. This is the period where, if we want to keep the planet below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we really have to drop emissions dramatically. Unfortunately, humanity is used to the idea of kicking the can down the road, and the road will always be there and the can will always land a little bit further. We have run out of road to kick the can down. So it's this period, roughly 2035 to 2040, by which we really have to attain dramatic global reductions in emissions. And so this piece where you can, even in this period of time where the climate is just beginning to diverge between 8.5 and 2.6, you can already see that this fork in the road is beginning to part.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a really critical period of time.
Yeah, it is. I mean, those juxtapositions become very clear even by 2030. Yeah. Thank you. And I have a few questions again from the audience around a similar theme, kind of a thought exercise. Any thoughts about how, so with the shutdowns and sequestration for the current virus, COVID virus. We know that there's been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I guess any thoughts for starters about how you might actually represent that musically, Richard? Or Bill and Richard, because it is it's a partnership there.
While Richard is gathering his thoughts, so there's multiple different agents or chemical species that affect the climate. Some of them are very short-lived, so they're like smog, right? If you get a good rainstorm, the smog disappears. And there are other long-lived agents that take a long time to remove from the Earth's atmosphere. The signals from the shutdown in airline travel and transportation travel have already been, and I'm sorry to say, but the event that anticipated this was the complete shutdown and cessation of airline travel over the United States after 9/11, because all the contrails went away. So we used the 9/11 period, and we can use the current period to look at the sort of almost instantaneous effects of shutting off aviation on short-lived things like pollutants in the upper atmosphere, contrails, and so forth. And there's been a dramatic drop-off in the nitrogen compound emissions associated with driving. And so, yeah, the signal is measurable. It is being measured, and there's going to be a ton of scientific studies based on what's happening right now. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Richard.
Well, I'm not. So is the question how you would model this musically? Is that basically?
Well, I think, yeah. Do you have thinking about how that would be reflected musically, kind of given the structure that you've created with Icarus?
Given the structure I've created.
With the data. And the one thing I was going to just say, but one thing that comes to mind for me is that a year is 8 seconds, right?
Right.
So this would be, I don't know how long this will go on, but I mean, it would be, in the seconds.
A few seconds. It would be a few seconds. Yeah, it would be a few seconds. I think I think I might be able to address some of that question when I introduce the next clip. But yeah, I mean, if I were using the same way of translating, by the way, I think I made maybe 4 different attempts at trying to understand how to map the data into musical dimensions before I settled on the one that I actually used. But I think there are innumerable ways of doing this. In a different piece. If I were to do this again, I would. Of course, I certainly wouldn't want to do it the same way. So there, and of course, other composers who've worked with the Climate Music Project have done this in their own way too. If I were working with the same data sets, well, population is not decreasing significantly in spite of the tragedy of so many coronavirus deaths. It's not. In fact, it was interesting looking at population data. There's you see a little tiny notch in the data that represents the years of World War II, for instance. These things don't have an enormous impact on population yet, at least. And in terms of carbon emissions, of course, that is something that that I model in the piece, right? That's the low to high spread of the frequency. So if that starts to diminish, then that what we musicians call the tessitura, the distance from the lowest to the highest sounding sounds diminishes. Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda.
I might jump in on this conversation as well, and less from how you would do the composition, but sort of some of the things that have occurred to me in watching the communication of science around the novel coronavirus. And I sort of have 3 things that have occurred to me. One is that I feel like, and I hope that this is reinforcing the importance of science to everybody, that how critical it is that we have science at the ready to be able to address these questions. The Academies is doing work, everyone is really stepping up, and I'm hoping that kind of reminds people that this work is really so critical. I see a lot of parallels with the challenges we have in climate communication, and conversations I have with my friends where they're like, I'm so frustrated that there's not a single answer, that there's uncertainty here. And that's exactly the same kind of thing we encounter in talking about climate. And so I'm hoping that some of that there'll be some general public education about how you think about scientific data and how you interpret it and how you apply it in your decision making, even under conditions of uncertainty, because that is how it's going to have to proceed. And then the last thing that I've been thinking about some is that I feel like often in climate communication, we're reluctant to talk about the hard truths, that the facts that, really getting and addressing the climate problem means dealing with consumption and perhaps making sacrifice or changing our behaviors in some ways. And we've seen people do that on a wholesale basis in the last several weeks or months. And it hasn't been all bad. I mean, I think that I hear conversations of there are the lovely aspects of our current situation. I know I see my family more, I get outside more, and I don't spend as much time commuting as I used to. And I'm hopeful that this allows us to open up that door to have some of those hard conversations and about where we need to go in the future. And actually, I was reflecting about the summit that's sort of a challenge to our artists out there is that I think the science often emphasizes the risks and the negative potential aspects of our future. But there are beautiful aspects of what these changes could mean for how we live and how we interact with people and connect with people. And I think it would be lovely if artists could help us imagine a more complete vision of how a world in which we've addressed climate change would look.
And actually, Lori, so much of what's going on now is this kind of rediscovery of community and in different ways. And I know that the Climate Music Project works a lot with community organizations, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
We do. I mean, yeah, frankly, our goal and objective and mission is not to create music, it's to drive action. And so we do work with a network of partner organizations so that we can steer audiences that are emotionally moved by each composition. We can steer them to communities where they can engage, because in order to solve this problem on a global scale, we need community, we need active communities, we need people working in their churches and synagogues, we need people working with their schools, with their businesses. And we serve as kind of a connecting. I was on a panel or a thing this morning, a presentation this morning. I was not on a panel, and someone said each discipline has become its own audience. So the scientists are talking to the scientists, and the musicians are talking to the musicians. And in order to solve this, I thought that was great. In order to solve this, we need to collect everyone together and all start rowing in the same direction. And we all have our skills and capabilities, and we just need to harness all of that and move the right way. And so we actually partner with 5 organizations right now. We're looking to grow. We partner with Cool Effect, Interfaith Power and Light, the Global Footprint Network, Revolve, and the San Francisco Department of the Environment. But we're looking to grow so we have communities we can plug into all over the world and get people involved and engaged.
That's actually, that answers the question that just came in like a minute ago about how you spread this message that is in the music to people who don't come to concerts. So that's kind of that starts the extension of that work.
Yeah, well, that's a good point too. And actually, in some ways, this pandemic that we're experiencing now has actually helped us, because it's really made us pivot more to online programming. We're trying to be more active on social media. We'll be posting some clips and whatnot to Instagram and Twitter and all the usual social media outlets. We'll be creating a more robust YouTube channel so that people can access. And then we really, really want to work with musicians everywhere. So, someone may do a country music composition in the South and reach audiences there. We might have someone doing music in South America, many countries in South America. We'd love to do a percussion piece, just get everyone in their own communities, they're already in their communities, they care about climate, they can bring the message that way.
Somebody actually, there was a question that just came in about how you can learn these skills to work with data in composing music. So again, that would be something hopefully to be able to spread the message about as well, or teach the skills for. Why don't we listen to the last clip, and then there are definitely some great questions in from the audience, which we can ask after that.
Yeah, so the last clip is the end of the piece. Represents the years from 2056 to 2080. This clip actually begins with the RCP 8.5 music, and of course that music becomes more extreme, to the point where it's almost chaotic. And it becomes much easier actually to hear the difference between the 2.6 and 8.5 types of music because of that, right? The RCP 2.6 music, it's business as usual. It remains more or less the same. Well, actually, it doesn't. One of the things you can hear very easily in this clip is that with RCP 2.6, there's a gradual diminution of carbon emissions to a point where they actually become negative. And you'll hear this easily enough in the violin has a series of descending passages against the cello, which is coming up in pitch. And I think that's pretty clear to hear in this clip. And of course, the RCP 2.6 music remains active, underpinned by this repeated note idea, because the population doesn't stop growing. It doesn't grow as much as it would under other scenarios, but it does continue to grow. So I think that's a good enough introduction to the fourth clip.
Great, let's listen. Thank you. So it is striking, I think, how that last segment at 2.6, is kind of evocative of the beginning of the piece. Obviously not as slow, but it does kind of gives you a little more calm, I guess. There is a question from online, from the audience, which is about the 8.5 RCP scenario. I mean, is the only prediction for that scenario that there's kind of exponential increase in temperature?
Well, it's not exponential, but it does get, the planet is already warmed over 1 degree Celsius relative to pre-industrial times, and it warms on average about another 3 degrees Celsius starting from now to the end of the century. But it's important to know that because carbon dioxide is sort of a you broke it, you bought it model of a greenhouse gas, that warming continues long after 2100. So in some sense, the piece ends just when we're getting through the appetizer course of the climate change that RCP 8.5 would bring. It's a very, I think the things that are about it that are striking are that the emissions of carbon dioxide in that scenario by the end of the 21st century are 100 times what they were at the beginning of this piece of music. So that we're now pumping out CO2 and other greenhouse gases 100 times more vigorously than when we started in the late 19th century. And the concentration of CO2 will be, this is going to be in a technical terminology, but 750 parts per million. The thing that's striking about that is that it's, we haven't had CO2 levels that high for 30 million years. So it's as if our engines are time machines and our car engines are taking us back in time. But in just 300 years, they've managed to take us back 30 million years. Now, what's special about 30 million years ago? That's when the ice sheets in Antarctica began to form. So it's just a completely radical alteration of the Earth's environment that RCP 8.5 is envisioning. Radical, and yet that's business as usual.
Thank you. This is probably a good moment to segue into what I think is a great question and kind of might help. Richard, you can summarize some of this. What is the meaning of the title of the piece, Icarus in Flight?
Yeah, well, I may just read you from the program note from the premiere performance, which says it better than I probably could extemporize it. So this refers to Icarus. This is from Greek myth. Icarus was the son of Daedalus, and the two were imprisoned by King Minos on the Isle of Crete in the Mediterranean. Daedalus was a brilliant craftsman and fashioned wings of feathers fixed with wax for himself and his son to escape from the island, and by flying, right? He warned his son against flying too low, where the moisture from the sea might make the wings too heavy, and he warned him against flying too high, where the heat of the sun might melt the wax that fixed the feathers. But elated by the thrill of flight and hubris, Icarus ignored his father's admonitions, venturing too high into an environment too warm to sustain him, which is exactly where we are. We're in an environment that's too warm to sustain us. But as long as Icarus is in flight, there's hope that he can conquer his hubris and land safely on Earth.
So a message of warning and hope. Yeah, warning and hope.
Yes.
Thank you. So there were, again, a few questions that revolved around kind of this integration of art and science and data, including, have there been attempts to put the data to poetry, let's say, and have there been any kind of dance performances either to this piece or anything else? And I thought, Lori, maybe, again, I know you have a lot of projects ahead of you. Are you looking at other kind of art forms and data?
Well, I mean, definitely we have other collaborators that we are working with, and Richard, I believe, has done one section of this work has actually been put to dance with a group called Kinetech Arts, and they've done some amazing choreography, Diane Lopez, and we have also hosted more for the celebration of the Global Climate Summit that was in San Francisco. We kind of hosted a platform where people could come and express what they wanted the future to sound like. It wasn't climate music per se, but it gave artists, poets, spoken word, all types of artists, the opportunity to use their platform to reach people in a variety of ways. And we like to encourage that because everybody has a role to play. And then we also collaborate with an artist in Chicago, Elisa Singer, who has an organization called Environmental Graffiti, GRAPHITI. And she actually did one of the covers for the IPCC report. Yeah. She takes the data and converts the graphs that the IPCC uses into beautiful artwork. So yes, there's no end to this. We will maintain a focus on music because that's our kind of core competency, and we like to maintain that, and we believe that music has a unique way of reaching people on a really emotional level, and we think we need to reach people emotionally in order to have the kind of magnitude and amplification that we would like to have to drive action on climate.
Great. And where can people see this piece afterwards online, or where could they access?
Sure, we do have some clips of our music available online. We do not do full performances because we do like to present the music in context. So usually when we're doing a presentation, a performance, we will have a kind of opening introduction of what it all means so people can understand what they're listening to. Then we'll have the piece, and then we'll usually have a panel discussion that might, depending on the subject. We did one at the Exploratorium that focused on transportation, and we had some of our partners come and talk about what they're doing on electrification, for example. So we like to put the whole thing in context. We feel like it's more, meaningful sometimes when it's live and when we can kind of set a context. But as I said, we are pivoting to doing, finding ways to do more online and also work with kind of communities at more of a distance so they can put their own presentations together.
Great. And remind me of your URL?
Sorry, that would have been a good plug for me. Yeah. It's climatemusic.org. Pretty simple. Great. And lots of information on there. Feel free to get in touch. We're also looking, just like I said, we want to reach musicians all across the world so they can do in their own communities. We also want to expand our science team. So if there's any science people out there that want to work with music and have stories to tell, we kind of coordinate among our science advisory group on what are the stories that aren't being told out there that the public needs to hear about, that we really need to kind of drive a little bit more emotionally. We are seeking to do that. So our next composition is actually going to be focused on biodiversity and geared toward kids. We're looking to do a 4-minute animated, 4 or so minute animated short that will focus on biodiversity in forests. And we're working with Dr. David Ackerley with the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley, and Allison Markline as well, Wendy Silver. We have also Tapio Schneider, who's a professor at Caltech, is part of our science advisory group, and we're trying to build that as well.
So there's a lot to stay tuned for. Clearly.
There is, and I can't even go explain everything, but we are ambitious because we need to be ambitious.
Yeah, it's an important topic. So we're just almost out of time. So what I wanted to do was just ask each of you before we end the program to, in a word or no more than a phrase or a sentence, just tell our audience what you would like people to walk away with, either in terms of feeling or I don't want to put any words in your mouth. So what would you like people to walk away with? Do you want to start with, I know it's hard when you're all on we'll start with Richard. I'm going in who's in order on my screen.
Well, I guess climate change is the great intangible of our time, isn't it? I mean, Bill said earlier that these greenhouse gases, you can't smell them, you can't taste them, you can't see them. And so it's easy in a way for us to ignore all of this. And we just can't do that anymore.
Thank you. Bill, you're next in my line.
2 words, let's roll.
Great. Thank you. How about Lori?
We'd love for everyone to join us on our journey. We're all in this together. We need a multidisciplinary approach at all levels to reach people, and yeah, let's get this rolling.
Thank you. And Amanda.
So I hope people leave with a sense of urgency that this isn't a problem that we need to be moving quickly to address. We need to roll on, as Bill said, but also a sense of hope that, I think that it is not insolvable. There is amazing ingenuity happening in the scientific engineering community and in the arts, and it's really going to take all of us together to achieve what we need to do. But I think it's well within the space of human ingenuity and capability.
Well said.
That's great. So the summary is there's lots to be done and lots we can do, and let's roll, right? Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you, like the 4 panelists and discussants. It was really great to have this conversation. I want to thank our audience. I'd like to thank the National Academies of Sciences, and especially cultural programs and LabX. And yeah, let's roll.
Thank you all for organizing and hosting and moderating. It's been a pleasure.
Lovely. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Barbara and JD and the whole National Academy of Sciences staff. Thank you.
Very special way to spend the 50th Earth Day. So yeah,
Yes,
fantastic.
Happy Earth Day again.
Yeah.